and welcome to this Astranti pre-seen video. This is the top 10 most likely unseen issues for the May and August strategic case study exam for Runnabout.
So before we start, I'm just going to go through a bit of an introduction to this particular video and where I've got the information on and what you need to do with said information. So how have I come up with these top 10? Well, first of all, you look at the focus in the pre-scene. If there's a lot of material in the pre-scene on a certain topic, then it's likely that there is some kind of importance of that topic. It's likely to be brought up in the exam, so there's more to talk about. And that feeds into the second point here, the degree of importance attached to it by the examiner. But that particular section extends beyond purely what's in the pre-scene, but also what CIMA like to examine. For example, ethics. It may be that there's no real mention of ethics in the case study, but ethics is considered very important by CIMA, and therefore they are likely to examine it. Next is the strategic importance. How important is it to the organization? If a certain topic is very important to the company, for example, say their suppliers. If they rely very heavily on a certain supplier, then it's likely that there might be an issue on the supplier. If something were to happen to that supplier, what impact could that have on the business? And also, just a more general experience in doing these videos in creating mock exams and reviewing exams in the past, the typical kind of issues that come up, and what kind of things have the examiner brought up in the past. And my final point here is about how easy it is to write issues on that subject. The people who write the exams are obviously people too, and they will go for ones that they know, that they can write good questions on. So what do you need to do for these issues? Well, first of all, it's important to prepare key models. So this will be things like your SWOT exam, like SWOT analysis, like your PESTLE analysis. Because building up this information now will help you to adapt the new information given you in the unseen, or help you to have that context to apply the unseen material. Next thing you need to do is practice exam questions on these issues. This will help you to understand the kind of questions that will be asked around these topics and how to answer them. And also, this next section here, it will help you to plan these answers in your mind so that when you go into the exam and you start writing, you'll already have a background in which to apply this new information. You'll already have certain points to bring up in your head as you're writing for them. And I've also put some more generic things here, such as the advantages and disadvantages of these certain topics, where they would be used and how models can be used to support them. So let's move on to the top 10 issues now.
And we'll start with issue number 10, which is funding. And the reason why I've chosen funding is because it's a key F3 topic. It links to a lot of the important topics from the P3 syllabus. So it looks at equity funding, debt funding, cost of capital, etc. And most importantly, it's often used as part of other questions. You're not likely to get a question that is just on funding, as in an entire exam question that's just talking about equity funding or debt funding, etc. It's often part of other questions. Perhaps you've got to analyze a project and then you have to mention that we don't have enough money for it right now and we have to source additional funding, and where would we get that funding from? And it's also mentioned as part of the role that you are playing in the strategic case study exam. So if you think back to those I can statements, those core activities, etc., it mentions about sourcing finance, sourcing funding. And this is a very, very common issue. It's arisen in many, many different case studies in the past, and there's no reason to suggest that it wouldn't appear again, particularly given its use as an add-on and its mention in the role given to us by CIMA. And it's important to remember that cash is going to be needed to support large investment projects, and there's many potential ones that Runnabout might pursue, and they don't necessarily have enough funding at the moment, at least in cash and cash equivalents, to source the funding needed for these different projects. And so likely issues could be for a new project. Perhaps it's an acquisition. They're going to purchase a smaller company, or they're going to purchase a smaller supplier so that they reduce their dependence on maneuvering robotics. Perhaps they've got new projects. They want to branch out into several new cities, or they want to start using a different service, or they want to start offering a different service in addition to the hoverboards. They want to do scooters or something like that, or just general organic growth as well. They want to invest a lot into current operations to expand upon it, or they want to improve their head office, or whatever it may be. It may also be for a short-term working capital issue. In the pre-scene, we saw that the cash and cash equivalents was just over $2 billion G, and that sounds like a lot, but remember that they did have trade payables of over $7 billion G already, so they couldn't actually pay those trade payables with the cash that they have at the moment. And of course, there's a lot of other things that go into working capital that can't be pushed back, that must be paid. Staff salaries, for example. You can't push back paying staff salaries, tell them that, oh, we'll probably have money in a few months' time to pay you, but for now, just carry on as normal without getting paid. You can't arrange a credit line like you could with a supplier. And it's most likely to appear as an add-on to an investment issue, as already stated. So it could be that we are going to acquire this particular company, or we do want to branch into this particular market or export overseas, etc., but we don't have the money at the moment, so we need to raise additional financing because we either can't afford it at the moment, or if we do use all the money that we have, we may run into short-term working capital issues and so forth. It's all conjoined together. And some key points here from the pre-scene that you can use in your analysis. As already mentioned, they have just over $2 billion or just over $2.3 billion G in the bank at the moment, but a lot of that will be needed for working capital given that the current liabilities are already much higher. In fact, 3 times higher or so. And that, of course, will need to be paid within the trading year. And as such, what we must remember, what you must remember as a student, is to not say, we've got $2.3 billion G available, let's invest in this $2.3 billion project. Because, of course, that is not what that cash is for. That cash is not to be used freely on anything that takes your fancy. A lot of that is going to be needed for working capital. So we do potentially need to either raise more finance internally in order to pay for these projects or source funding elsewhere. And it's also very prudent to have a reasonable amount of cash in cash equivalents for working capital. So also that cash and cash equivalents figure in the statement of financial position shouldn't drop below a certain amount, because that cash is could be needed for a rainy day, so to speak. As I mentioned here, that budgeting for your cash flow is critical. You must prepare for times where you may have negative cash flow, perhaps on a monthly basis, and therefore have a reasonable amount of buffer cash ready for those situations. And debt is already quite high as well, gearing at 54.82 or 121.33%, depending on which method you use. We've used debt over equity or debt over debt plus equity. There's no right or wrong method to use as long as you are quite clear in which one you have used. And you always use the same method, so you're not comparing one year to another year or one company to another company using different methods. But they do have a reasonable amount of tangible assets, quite a high amount of tangible assets, over 128, nearly 129 billion G worth, and that could be used as security to raise debt again. So it could be that they take on additional debt funding. If you're wondering that these gearing ratios look quite high and that could cause a problem for raising additional debt funding. That is possible and banks will look at that. But what I would also say is that this is a tech company and tech companies are renowned for having very high gearing ratios. In fact, companies like Tesla in the past have had gearing ratios in the hundreds of percent. And the suggested order for raising funds is to start with using cash if you have cash available. We know cash might be a bit tight, but if it's for very, very small projects, just the odd 100,000 G dollars here and there, then perhaps it's best to use cash because money you already have. There's no real risk involved. If you need to raise more, then the best thing to do is to use debt funding, either secured against assets and from a bank. And finally, equity. And equity is usually the last resort because of the cost involved. It can cost millions and millions to raise additional equity funding, and it can take months, it can take up to a year to raise that finance. But this is perhaps the best way if you need to raise an enormous amount of money. If you literally need to raise tens and tens of billions of G dollars, then this is the best method to do that. And the reason why it is better is because you do not have to pay it back. Dividends are optional and there's no need to pay back the capital. Investors invest at their own risk. If they lose money, that's on them. That's not necessarily on you as the company. Of course, you want to provide a good return to keep people investing in the company. But unlike debt, which does have mandatory interest payments, it is perhaps sometimes an efficient way of raising a very large amount of money at a better cost to the business in the long run. It's expensive in the short term, but when you have high levels of debt, you have very high interest payments, and that can cost the company in the long term. But for medium levels, debt financing is often better because it's very quick. It's generally low cost to raise that. And when you are thinking about the people who've provided you or the stakeholders that provided the funding, you need to put those into your Mendelow's matrix and your stakeholders matrix. So where do they sit? And that will also determine how you treat them. Banks often sit in the high power, low interest, in that they don't really mind as long as you are paying off your interest payments. They don't really care. Whereas perhaps a really big, powerful institutional shareholder would be in your high interest and high power because they will be a lot more interested and want to be much more involved in the way the organization is being run. Issue number 9 now, and that's ethics. And ethics is chosen, again, like funding, because it is the most commonly examined SCS topic. And in fact, it's not even one of the most commonly examined. It is the most commonly examined topic at the strategic case study. Appears in most variants. In fact, since the strategic case study was brought in all the way back in March 2015, there has been some form of ethics question, be it an add-on issue, be it a consideration, be it an actual full question on ethics itself, in 40 to 60% of all papers that have been sat in every single sitting since the very first one back in March 2015. So 40 to 60% of you watching this video right now could get an ethics question in their exam. And it's very important to CIMA, and CIMA wants to be seen to be testing people on ethics. It's a very important part to being a management accountant. CIMA wants ethical people to be qualified management accountants. So if you mess up really badly on an ethical question and you suggest something that's completely unethical, then they'll be looking at you through a microscope thinking, is this the person that we want as a qualified management accountant representing the body of qualified management accountants? And there is some specific focus in the pre-C. The nature of the industry does tie in with ethics, not necessarily in a morally right or wrong, but with health and safety. It's a big issue here. And there was talk in the articles as well about health and safety, and also the values and the social responsibility of the organization, as was mentioned in the value statement in the section along with the mission and vision statement. So likely issues could be to do with the environment and beneficial potentially for a company like Runnabout. It could be that there be some new laws brought in that affects motorists and affects public transport, etc. But as a very clean, economical, efficient way of traveling, like using a hoverboard, it might be of benefit. Although it could lead back to a question about where our electricity is coming from that's being used in the docking stations. Is it coming from renewable resources? Can we get additional tax credits if we do use ones from additional sustainable and recyclable sources, etc.? It's mentioned specifically in the values, looking to reduce the carbon footprint, and that will also have to factor in how we operate, in the things we suggest, in relations with our suppliers as well. Are our suppliers using the right sorts of materials that are beneficial and sustainable for the environment? Are they using recycled energy, etc.? Time with our legal and safety responsibilities as well. Who do we owe a duty of care to? Do we owe a duty of care to our stakeholders, such as our employees, the users, etc.? And all of this can have a negative impact on the reputation of the organization as well. And that's an important phrase, that duty of care. That's what you need to think about when you are answering a question on ethics. And other issues that have arisen in the past related to ethics, commonly in strategic case study exams, is issues over the treatment of suppliers and also the treatment of employees at suppliers. We have a very, very big, powerful supplier in Minoring Robotics who we rely on, and they could be mistreating their employees. We don't know at this point. There's no mention of supplier audits, etc. They're based in a different country. They may have different laws, etc. But we are expected to make sure that they are treating their employees well and to essentially stop operations with them if they are not. Example of Apple, when it was using a very large, powerful Chinese manufacturer, and there was a lot of mistreatment of staff going on, and Apple wasn't auditing their suppliers, and it was found that there was a lot of this mistreatment going on, and Apple got a lot of blame for it, even though they weren't directly responsible. Confidentiality, important as well, ensuring that this is often quite more internal to the organization rather than external to the organization, or it's more to do with individuals within the organization. If you have a manager or someone like that who is telling you things that are really quite bad that they've been doing, and if it's found out, then there's going to cause all those problems with the organization. And do you keep quiet, or do you have a duty to disclose that information to make sure that people are aware of it and that this issue can be resolved? Making sure you're not passing on information about users, be they sign up to our app, and making sure that we're not selling to third parties without approval first. Governance as well. Is there enough governance in the organization, or is it complying with the code of governance? The board at Runnabout was good, but there have been issues in the past where it hasn't. And finally, bribery. Never ever try to justify bribery in a CIMA case study exam, because CIMA will not like it one bit. Bribery is never acceptable in any circumstances, and this even includes non-direct bribes, as in, rather than the old traditional cartoony, here's a briefcase full of money to ensure that we get the contract, more the taking them out, treating them to a nice 5-star restaurant and a 5-star hotel, buttering people up to try and get a contract. And I appreciate that in the real world, ethics is quite grey, and you do have to balance it with business needs, etc. But in the CIMA exam, the attitude you want to take is that ethics is quite black and white. It's either ethical or it's not ethical. And this is because CIMA expect you to take the moral high ground, expect you to take action from an ethical perspective, and to always act ethically. And what I would suggest doing as well is to use recommendations in your ethics questions, and when you're talking about ethics, but do it from a short and long-term perspective. And that not only boosts the amount of points you can bring up and material you can get down, it also shows you are dealing with it in the way that a senior manager should do. So you bring up a short-term fix, to deal with a specific issue. Perhaps someone's been injured on one of the hoverboards, so you change the safety procedure. That's the reactive issue to deal with that. But then you also think, how can we stop other people from getting injured before? Could we perhaps put increased training, get new equipment, buy hoverboards that are safer to use, etc.? What we're doing is we're then preventing it from happening again. Rather than just dealing with specific issues as they arise, we're preventing the general theme of incidents such as accidents from happening again. And also pepper in the phrase, if you can, ethics is the right thing to do. It's doing the right thing is being ethical. And some key theories to use, obviously the CIMA ethical principles: integrity, confidentiality, professional behavior, objectivity, and competence and due care are part of the CIMA principles, and that's very important. It's important to use that. But what I would also say, even though the examiner's report says that you can basically always use this model when answering ethical questions, is talk about the model, mention the model, maybe mention the 5 principles, but then just talk about the one that is relevant. If it's a confidentiality question, say, here are the 5 ethical principles: integrity, confidentiality, professional behavior, etc. The issue here is confidentiality. Confidentiality is XYZ. Here's why it's a confidentiality breach, what we must do, etc. Don't spend loads of time talking about integrity and talking about professional behavior and talking about objectivity, because if it's a question about confidentiality, then that's the only one that you need to use fully when answering the question. Otherwise, you'll get no marks. It may be all great, it may be all correct what you've written, but if it's not answering the question, it will not get you marks. And another model here, the American Accounting Association resolution model. Now, of course, this is an American model and it's not directly examinable in the CIMA model, and you do not need to learn it. But it does have a few good ways in which you can assess ethics, and also some key headings that you could perhaps create a plan around in your exams, such as duty of care. Who do we owe a duty of care to? And you speak about who you owe a duty of care to. Ethical consequences. What's the end result and why is this bad? Values, norms, cultural norms, internal codes, the legal and the regulations in G-Land, etc. It's a way of building a plan to answer an ethical question. Use these as headers and turn these headers into paragraphs to get your marks. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you have enjoyed it, and more importantly, you have found it useful. I'd like to finish by just telling you a few things about the products that we produce here at Astranti and the ones that are part of our course. So these materials can all be purchased as part of the course or purchased individually. So we have our study text. We have 3 study texts for all the objective test exams. So 3 study texts for E1, P1, F2, F3, etc. But we also have the study text specifically for the case study exams, split into 2 parts. The first is about how to approach the exam, how to analyze the information, how to plan your answers, how to write your answers, and also the second part, which looks at the key theories from the objective test levels that are relevant to the particular case study. So if you are looking at P2, F2, E2 for the management exam, F3, P3, E3 for the strategic case study exam, and so on. We have our course videos, which look at how to plan your answers, how to manage your time effectively. These are the key reasons why people fail the exam. We have our pre-scene analysis, which looks at the pre-scene in a lot of depth, applies key information to that, and also concludes with the strategic analysis, where we look at the various different models in the CIMA syllabus and apply them to the case, and also the top 10 most likely issues to arise in your exam. Generally, we have a 70 to 80% accuracy rate on our top 10 issues. Our industry pack, which details in great depth the history and the current contemporary issues within the particular industry that the pre-scene is based on. We also have 20 to 25 industry examples that you can use within your answers. We have mock exams that can be purchased with or without marking and feedback, where you can get some real exam practice in. Look for the kinds of things that the examiner is going to bring up in the exam, and also get marking and feedback from expert markers who have marked for CIMA and for us for many years, who know exactly the kinds of things that the examiner is looking for, exactly the kinds of mistakes that students often make, and can provide lots of detailed feedback to ensure that you improve on your performance. We also have our master classes, which are 2-day-long classes which look at all the key issues facing students in the exam. We will also go through live planning, showing you how to plan your answers effectively, how to write your answers effectively. Again, key things that cause people to fail the strategic case study exam, or any of the case study exams for that matter. And also, if you do sign up for our course, provided that you have filled out your forms, provided that you have submitted your mocks, provided you have done everything to show that you have really given it your all to try and pass this exam, we also offer a pass guarantee, giving a free resit to anyone who fails the exam.